I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Mr. President, everyone likes butterflies. Children like to catch them. Often they don't understand that even touching their wings gently could hurt the butterfly or even make it unable to fly. But there are people who live around the world. In Belarus, for example, there are slightly more than 100 such butterfly people, some of whom are children, half of whom are children. Unfortunately, the poetic name hides a terrible disease, epidermolysis bullosa. This is a rare genetic disease where the skin and the mucous membranes, at even the slightest physical touch or even without it, forms blisters and erodes. The skin peels away, leaving an open wound, which constantly needs to be covered with special bandages and dressings and be protected from being injured once again. These special bandaging materials are produced overwhelmingly by one company in the world, a company with which until recently Belarus had very successful cooperation. After the latest round of European Union sanctions, the supply of that company's products to Belarus ended. When asked why a ban on the sale of these goods to the Belarus market was enforced, we received from the company the following answer: "We are afraid of sanctions being applied to our company." Subsequently, speaking to European journalists, the company's leadership acknowledged that in addition to just fears, there are also real problems, because due to unilateral sanctions, banks don't want to participate in deals with sanctioned customers or with other banks in sanctioned countries, which makes it impossible to sell these bandages, dressings, and other medical products to Belarus. Thus, by introducing sanctions, the European custodians of human rights are intentionally depriving sick children of the opportunity to play with their friends, to go to school, or quite simply to hug their own parents. Because without these special bandaging materials, any touch causes them unbearable pain. Unfortunately, we could provide dozens of examples of medical equipment and medicines needed to save people's lives being unable to enter Belarus due to the criminal sanctions policy of the USA, the European Union, and those that aid and abet them. Epilepsy medicines from Poland, Parkinson's and various forms of cancer medicine from Finland, and even simple painkillers from the United Kingdom. Belarus has built a top-class system of free medical care and medicines, and we rapidly found replacements for these medicines. But the problem, that's not the problem. We've repeatedly heard, including in this hall, as well as today from the representative of the European Union, we've heard assurances about humanitarian exemptions and about the targeted nature of unilateral sanctions. All of this is nothing more than false and empty statements. In reality, as I just demonstrated with a specific example, we are talking about people's lives and their health, particularly that of women and children. When the authors and supporters of unilateral measures and the pseudo-politicians that finance them applaud the latest raft of sanctions, please remember that they are the ones that are depriving a child with a rare disease of the chance to lead a normal life and depriving a seriously ill pensioner of the chance to see their great-grandchildren or their grandchildren. They are the ones that are dooming millions of people in the countries of the Global South to starving to death. And that is no exaggeration. The statements of the USA and the European Union to the effect that their unilateral sanctions do not extend to potash fertilizer are also a lie. A direct consequence of the sanctions against Belarus's potassium fertilizer, which constitutes almost a third of global exports, was a significant drop in harvest yields in Africa. We understand that the UN can't force states to lift their unilateral sanctions, but the UN has always been, for us, and it remains, a form of moral compass when it comes to illegal coercive measures. The Secretary General of the UN is calling for these sanctions to be lifted, together with the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, UNICEF, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on human rights, as well as hundreds of experts and researchers into the subject of unilateral coercive measures around the world. Those behind this must understand the real result of unilateral sanctions. They violate all thinkable norms of international law and all human rights, and they aim exclusively at undermining the independent foreign policy of some undesirable countries. There is no such thing as so-called smart sanctions. Any illegal economic sanctions aim to strangle and destroy the economy of a country, and that means they aim to lower the living standards of the people. European and American economists have long ago analyzed the impact of sanctions, and it has been proven that sanctions have an impact first and foremost on the most vulnerable citizens, but at the same time they affect to varying degrees the entire population of the countries against which those sanctions are introduced. The impact of sanctions is entirely tangible. They lower life expectancy, they lower per capita incomes, and they increase the gulf in the poverty level. Illegal unilateral sanctions have a negative impact on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It is telling, for example, that in Belarus, which on the whole is successfully fulfilling its development program, Belarus is somewhat behind in achieving specifically those national goals that are affected by Western sanctions, including access to medicines. Analyzing the data on the impact of sanctions on people, researchers have come to the conclusion that unilateral measures in terms of their impact are comparable with acute armed conflicts and natural disasters. We suggest that unilateral illegal sanctions should be considered not only economic terrorism, but also acts of aggression with all the attendant consequences. Mr. President, Belarus is proud of its achievements in social policy and the economy. In a context of unprecedented pressure, Belarus has been able not only to persist as a sovereign state, but also to continue to develop and to fulfill all of its social obligations to its citizens.